In this presentation, we are going to explore the characteristics of plants that are unique to them and identify organisms as members of the kingdom Plantae. And we're also going to be making reference to characteristics of plants that are going to be seen also in some of the Protists groups we identified previously as algae, the brown algae, red algae, green algae. And let's go ahead and begin there. When you look at algae and plants, one of the things that you will remember immediately is going to be that both of these organisms are capable of making their own food molecules like glucose through the process of photosynthesis. So that's going to be one of the things that come to mind immediately as you begin to think about algae and plants. Another characteristic that by now you've learned is that algae, for example, have organelles called plastids, like chloroplasts, and those are also found in plants. Additionally, algae also have cells that are going to be surrounded, protected by a cell wall, and there's going to be the same polysaccharide making the cell walls of plant cells, and that is going to be cellulose. However, there's only one group of protists, of organisms we also call commonly algae, that are going to be more similar to plants, and because there are several characteristics that are seen in plants and only in charophytes, that's the group, only in charophytes, not in the green algae or the red algae or the brown algae. Some scientists have formulated the hypothesis that plants are going to share a common ancestor with organisms called the charophytes. What are those characteristics? One of those is going to be that when you look inside of the plant cell, you're going to find that there are rings of proteins that are responsible for the making of cellulose. That type of protein responsible for making cellulose appears also arranged as rings in the charophytes. However, if you look at brown algae or red algae, the proteins that make cellulose are going to be arranged more in line, not forming a ring. Another characteristic that is shared between plants and the charophytes is going to be the presence of enzymes that are going to be found inside of organelles called peroxisomes. And those enzymes are going to be responsible for eliminating some of the metabolic byproducts, particularly some free radicals. And this is a way of helping eliminate some of the wastes organisms can generate during their metabolism. So plants have peroxisome enzymes, and also charophytes have peroxisome enzymes, but not the other algae groups. Additionally, when you look at plants, you're going to find that the sperm of some plants is going to be real similar in terms of the flagellated nature of the sperm that you find also in the charophytes. You may recall, for example, that brown algae also produces flagellated sperm, but the sperm has two flagella, one hairy, one smooth, but that is not the case with plants. And now you begin to realize some things that in the case of plants are going to be defying our traditional understanding of biology and the diversity in biology. For example, you may recall that in Bio 211, we talked about flagella as being a characteristic of animal cells. But now we're beginning to look at plants, and right from the beginning, we find that some plant groups are going to produce flagellated sperm. And so you have to be, especially now in Bio 213, you have to keep your mind open to some of these exceptions to rules that have emerged throughout your study of biology. So here's one of them. So yes, plants can produce cells with flagella, but that is only going to be the flagellated sperm in the plants that are still depending on water for reproduction. And we will study more in more detail those plants, which will be the bryophytes, and also ferns are going to have the flagellated sperm. There's one more characteristic, and there's going to be the formation of a phragmoplast. The phragmoplast is an arrangement of microtubules you see in the middle of the cell when plant cells divide. And those microtubules help organize the vesicles containing cellulose that are going to help make the cell plate, and eventually the cell walls that divide the two newly made cells that are made by the process of mitosis. And we see the same type of a phragmoplast, the arrangement of microtubules in the middle of the cell at the end of mitosis in the case of the charophytes. So now we can begin to see what are, the groups of organisms we have been talking about. Here's some of those protists, the red algae. Here's the chlorophytes or green algae. These are the ones we're talking about, the charophytes. But there's going to be some charophyte species that are going to be more similar to land plants as we know them. Some scientists have suggested that all the algae and the plants should be combined into one kingdom, especially if the algae that is included will be the chlorophytes. Then we will have a kingdom. It wouldn't be known as a kingdom Plantae, but it would be known as the Viridae Plantae. There are others that say, no, leave the red algae out, leave the chlorophytes or green algae out, just to include charophytes because of the similarities I just mentioned and the plants together. And if that's the case, then we would have a kingdom called the Streptophyta. But as it is right now, we have a kingdom Plantae. We are going to go through an exercise next in which we're going to be evaluating the characteristics that are unique to plants, the derived traits of plants. And so plants and members of the kingdom Plantae are going to be known as the embryophytes. And this is an interesting word. Embryo is going to be the early developmental stages that follow fertilization, follow the formation of the zygote. And so plants produce embryos as a consequence of sexual reproduction. And the suffix phyte, phyte, that means plant. So members of kingdom Plantae are going to be the embryophytes. These are going to be organisms that produce embryos during their sexual reproduction and the development of a new organism. So now we're going to go through an exercise, as I said before, like something similar to what you did for kingdom fungi. In kingdom fungi, you engaged in a discussion where you were describing what are the characteristics that make a fungus a fungus. Now we're going to be talking about the characteristics that make plants, well, a plant. And one of those is going to be the alternation of generations. In alternation of generations, we see that it takes 2 generations of organisms to complete one life cycle of a plant. We can pick up this life cycle of a plant focusing at first on this generation called the gametophyte. Remember that the suffix phyte, P-H-Y-T-E, means plant. What kind of a plant is a gametophyte? Well, it's a plant that produces gametes. That is the main mission of this plant in the life cycle of a plant. Gametophytes, in the case of the fern gametophyte we see in this illustration, are going to be tiny in most plants. This gametophyte, you see it here, shaped like a heart, green in color, is capable of photosynthesis, but they're so tiny. The diameter of one of these gametophytes, you see illustrated here, is actually going to be like the thickness of a pencil lead. Imagine a regular pencil and the thickness of the lead inside. That's how large or how small, I should say, is going to be the diameter of this organism you see right here. So gametophytes in plants are going to be responsible for making eggs and sperm. In this fern gametophyte, there is a region where eggs are going to be formed, another one where sperm is going to be made, and the sperm swims over to the eggs to go through the process of fertilization. Following fertilization, there's going to be the union of the egg and the sperm forming a zygote. And this is now a diploid cell. Notice that the gametes are haploid. Each gamete contains only one set of chromosomes. And when N, then one set of chromosomes in an egg joins N, the set of chromosomes in a sperm, now you have a diploid or 2N organism. Then the zygote is going to proceed to develop through many rounds of cell division, we call that mitosis, until it produces a mature sporophyte. Now think about the name for this generation. This is the generation of plants that was produced by sexual reproduction, through sexual reproduction by these plants over here. So this is a new generation of plants. Now these are the ones we recognize as a fern. We call this a fern. And it's a sporophyte generation that we recognize as ferns. This is going to be a plant that is going to be responsible for producing spores. Sporophyte, phyte means plant, the plant that makes the spores. And what we're going to see here is that these spores are going to be made by the process of meiosis. Meiosis is a type of division that cuts the number of chromosomes in half. Since the cells of the sporophyte are diploid because they develop from a diploid zygote, in order to make haploid spores, meiosis is going to be needed. And these spores are going to develop by the process of mitosis into a new gametophyte. But because these spores are haploid and they begin to develop through mitosis into a gametophyte, the gametophyte is also going to be haploid. And now we come to another one of those shocking moments in biology, where we know that the gametophyte's mission is to produce gametes, sex cells. But these sex cells are made by the process of mitosis. What? Yes, before in Bio 211, you learned that in humans, gametes, sex cells, are made by the process of meiosis. But that's because we're diploid and we need to make sex cells with only half the number of chromosomes. That's why we need meiosis. But in the case of the gametophyte plant, it needs to make sex cells, but the gametophyte itself is already haploid. You cannot have like half of only one set of chromosomes into the sex cells that are going to be made. And so the type of division that preserves the number of chromosomes, comparing the parental cell to the daughter cells, that type of division is mitosis. So if you have a haploid organism and you want to produce haploid sex cells, the type of division that is going to be needed is mitosis. All right, so this may take a little bit of time for you looking at this illustration, thinking about the types of division and why we see in the case of plants, mitosis as the mechanism by which sex cells will be made. Now remember, with humans, we are different. We make our sex cells by the process of meiosis. Another characteristic of plant is that the diploid embryo, when the embryo is produced, is going to be retained within the tissues of the gametophyte. Remember, this gametophyte is going to be the plant that makes the gametes. So in the portion of the plant where the female gametes are made, where the eggs, that's where the embryo is going to be developed. Sometimes this happens in complete darkness, never exposed to light. Gametophytes never see the light of day. Think, for example, about plants that make fruits. The female gametophyte is trapped in there, inside of the fruit, inside of the structure that eventually becomes the seed. And that's where the embryo is going to be, in the seed. The embryos are going to be nourished by the tissues of the female gametophyte with the help of placental transfer cells. You can see here one of those embryos that is forming. This is going to be the surrounding gametophyte tissue, and between the female gametophyte and the embryo there are going to be cells like this one you see enlarged that are going to be providing nourishment, delivering nutrients to the embryo so that the embryo can continue to develop and be ready for the time of germination when the embryo sprouts into a new plant. Another characteristic of land plants, is going to be that when spores are made by the sporophyte, those spores are going to be surrounded and protected by a wall. The sporophyte is responsible for making spores inside of structures called sporangia. So pay attention to this word here. Spore is a reproductive cell. Angia means vessel, like a container, like a bottle. So sporangia are vessels, containers, where spores are made and kept until the moment they are ready to be released. There are going to be diploid cells in the sporophyte. Sporophytes are diploid, and those special diploid cells called sporocytes are the ones responsible for producing spores by the process of meiosis. Now think about this funny word over here, sporocyte. Cyte means cell, the cell responsible for producing the spores. So these sporocytes are inside of the sporangia. They will be producing spores inside of the sporangia, and we know now that the spore is going to be surrounded, protected by a wall, and that wall contains a polymer that is known as sporopollenin. This sporopollenin is going to be making the spore capable of withstanding the dry of the surrounding land environment, and also some relatively harsh conditions like some heat that an embryo would not be able to tolerate. A spore actually is able to withstand those harsh conditions because of the sporopollenin. One more characteristic of plants is going to be the multicellular gametangia. Now, here we go again with the funny words. Don't let these words intimidate you. Gametangia. You learned just a minute ago from me that angia means vessel, like a container. So gametangia will be the vessels that produce the gametes. So now we're looking at a gametophyte plant. It's the one that is going to have gametangia. And what we find in the female gametophyte is that the female gametangia have a specific name called archegonia. This is going to be where eggs are produced. The male gametophyte is going to have male gametangia, and the male gametes, sperm cells, are going to be produced inside of structures called antheridia. So archegonia is where eggs are produced. Antheridia is going to be where sperm is going to be produced. And a couple more characteristics of plants to finish, to wrap up this presentation. Apical meristems are going to be specialized tissues in a plant that are going to be responsible for growth. You can find apical meristem at the very tip of the plant where new leaves are forming. And you can also find apical meristem at the tips of roots, where the root is going to be increasing in length because more layers of cells are added by the process of mitosis. Similarly, in the apical meristem, where leaves are being made, those cells are engaged in a high rate of mitosis. They're making more cells, more cells, more cells, and eventually that's what makes a shoot grow and produce more leaves along the way. Plants are going to be protected also by a waxy cuticle, and this is important because most plants, land plants, they're going to be surrounded by dry air, and to prevent excessive water loss, wax is going to be the ideal material to seal water inside of the plant and prevent it from dehydrating. So these are the main characteristics that you can find in plants, and as we go through the various plant groups over the next couple of weeks, we are going to be exploring and seeing more examples of waxy cuticles, of the meristems. Also, we'll be talking about reproduction and the life cycles of plants, the alternation of generations. So all of these terms will be something that you will be reviewing and having a chance to practice and understand better. That's all for now. See you at the next presentation.